Margaret Sullivan wiped her hands on her apron and looked out the kitchen window at the land she'd called home for 47 years. The morning sun was just starting to climb over the hills, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. Her horses were already moving around in the pasture, and she could hear them nickering softly to each other. This was her favorite time of day, when everything was quiet and peaceful. And the world felt right. She was 93 years old now, and her body reminded her of that fact every single morning when she got out of bed. Her knees creaked, her back ached, and it took her a bit longer to get moving than it used to, but she didn't complain. This ranch, these 15 acres of rolling land in Pine Valley, was everything to her. It held the memory of her late husband, Tom, who'd passed away 12 years ago. It held the echoes of her 3 children running through the fields, climbing trees, and learning to ride horses. Every corner of this property had a story, and Margaret knew them all by heart. But lately something had changed. Something that made her stomach twist with worry every time she thought about it. It started about 6 months ago, when the developers came in and built that fancy new neighborhood right next to her property. Meadowbrook Estates, they called it. Big houses with perfect lawns, expensive cars in the driveways, and an entrance with marble pillars that looked like something out of a movie. Margaret didn't mind having neighbors. She'd always been friendly with folks. But these weren't just neighbors. These people came with something she'd never dealt with before, a homeowners association. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Margaret remembered because Tuesdays were when she usually went into town for groceries. But that day she stayed home because one of her horses had been limping. The envelope was thick and official-looking, with the Meadowbrook HOA logo printed on the corner. She'd opened it at her kitchen table, reading the words slowly, having to go back and read them again because they didn't make sense. According to the letter, her property now fell under the jurisdiction of the Meadowbrook HOA. There had been some kind of boundary reassessment, they said, and her ranch was technically part of their community now. The letter went on to list several violations. Her wooden fence, the one Tom had built with his own hands 30 years ago, was apparently not up to community standards. It needed to be replaced with an approved style of fencing within 60 days, or she'd face fines. Margaret had stared at that letter for a long time, reading it over and over. How could her fence suddenly be a problem after 3 decades? She'd called the number at the bottom of the letter and spoke to a woman who sounded bored and unhelpful. The woman told her to take it up with the HOA board if she had concerns. Margaret tried to explain that she'd been here long before any of them, that her property had always been separate. But the woman just repeated the same thing about the boundary reassessment and hung up. That first letter was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, another one came. This time they had a problem with her horse stable. It was aesthetically incompatible with the community standards, they said. The paint was faded, and the structure didn't match the architectural guidelines. Margaret had built that stable 20 years ago with money she'd saved up for months. Her horses lived in that stable. It was solid and well-maintained, even if it didn't look like something out of a fancy magazine. Then came the letter about her garden. Her beautiful vegetable garden that she'd tended every spring and summer for longer than she could remember. Apparently, vegetable gardens were only allowed in designated backyard areas, and hers was too close to the road. Non-compliant landscaping, they called it. She needed to remove it or relocate it within 30 days. Margaret tried to fight back the only way she knew how. She wrote letters explaining her situation. She tried calling the HOA office again and again. She even drove over to the HOA office building, a small structure near the entrance of Meadowbrook Estates, and tried to speak to someone in person. That's when she met Derek Vance. Derek was the HOA president, a man in his 50s with slicked back hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in 6 months. He looked at her like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. She tried to explain her situation calmly, showing him the deed to her property, explaining that she'd been grandfathered in, that her land had been here long before any homeowners association existed in this area. Derek barely looked at her paperwork. He leaned back in his chair with this smug smile and said, "Rules are rules, Mrs. Sullivan. We can't make exceptions just because you've been here a long time. If we let you slide, we'd have to let everyone slide, and then what's the point of having standards?" Margaret felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "Young man," she'd said, keeping her voice steady, "I'm not asking to slide. I'm telling you that your association has no authority over my property. I own this land free and clear. Derek's smile didn't waver. The boundary reassessment says otherwise. You can hire a lawyer if you want to dispute it. But in the meantime, those fines are accumulating. Currently, you're at, he glanced at his computer screen, $47,000. That number goes up every week you remain non-compliant. Margaret's heart had nearly stopped. $47,000? She was on a fixed income, living off Tom's pension and Social Security. She didn't have that kind of money. She didn't have a fraction of that money. You can't be serious, she'd whispered. I'm very serious, Mrs. Sullivan. And if you don't pay, we'll have no choice but to place a lien on your property. After that, well, we can force a sale to recover our costs. He'd stood up then, indicating the meeting was over. I suggest you get your affairs in order. Margaret had driven home that day with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. A lien on her property. They could force her to sell her home, the land Tom had worked so hard to buy, the place where she'd raised her children and buried her favorite dog and planted a tree for every grandchild. They could take it all away. She tried to handle it on her own. She was proud, maybe too proud, and she didn't want to worry her children. Her daughter lived in Seattle with her own family and struggles. Her youngest son was dealing with a divorce, and her oldest boy, James, he was deployed overseas. He was a Navy SEAL, gone for months at a time on missions he couldn't talk about. The last thing he needed was to worry about his mother when he was in some dangerous place halfway around the world. But the harassment didn't stop. The letters kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. Men started showing up at her property, walking around with clipboards and cameras, taking pictures of her fence, her stable, her garden. They didn't ask permission. They just showed up like they owned the place. One of them even had the nerve to tell her she needed to trim her oak tree because it was blocking the view from someone's house in the neighborhood. The oak tree. Tom had proposed to her under that tree 68 years ago. Margaret stopped sleeping well. She'd lie awake at night listening to every sound, worried that someone would show up to force her off her land. She stopped going into town as much. She didn't want to face people, didn't want them to see how scared she was. Her hands trembled when she sorted through the mail each day, dreading what new violation they'd found, what new impossible demand they'd make, finally. On a night when the fear was too much to bear alone, Margaret sat down at her kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen. Her handwriting wasn't as steady as it used to be, but she wrote carefully, pouring out everything that had happened. She addressed the letter to James, sealed it, and mailed it the next morning before she could change her mind. She didn't know if he'd even get it, wherever he was. She didn't know if he could help. But he was her son, and she'd run out of options. As she dropped that letter in the mailbox, Margaret whispered a prayer that somehow, some way, things would be okay. She had no idea that the letter she'd just sent would change everything. Commander James Sullivan's boots hit American soil after 18 months of deployment that felt more like 18 years. He'd been in places he couldn't name, doing things he couldn't talk about with men who trusted him with their lives and whom he trusted with his. The mission had been successful, but success in his line of work came with a price. He'd lost 2 friends, seen things that would wake him up at night for years to come, and pushed his body and mind to limits most people couldn't imagine. But through it all, through every difficult moment and dangerous situation, one thought had kept him going: home, his mother's ranch, the place where he'd grown up, where he'd learned to ride horses before he could properly ride a bike, where the smell of his mom's cooking and the sound of the wind through the trees meant safety and peace. That ranch was his anchor, the reason he did what he did. He fought to protect places like that, families like his. So when he finally got stateside and powered on his phone after months of limited communication, the last thing he expected was the voicemail that nearly brought him to his knees. His mother's voice came through the speaker, and it was wrong. All wrong. Margaret Sullivan was the strongest woman he knew. She'd raised 3 kids mostly on her own after his dad died. She'd kept the ranch running through droughts and economic downturns. She'd never asked for help, never complained, never showed fear. But in that voicemail, her voice shook. Jamie, she'd said, using the childhood name that no one but her was allowed to use. I need you. I didn't want to bother you while you were away, but I don't know what else to do. They're trying to take the ranch. There's this homeowners association, and they're saying I owe them money and they've put some kind of lien on the property, and these men keep coming around. I'm scared, honey. I'm so scared. Please, when you get this, call me. Or better yet, come home if you can. I need you." James played the message 3 times, his jaw getting tighter with each replay. Someone was threatening his mother. Someone was scaring her badly enough that she'd reached out for help. Something she never did. He didn't bother unpacking. He didn't check in with friends or stop by his apartment. He threw his bag in his truck and started driving. The ranch was 8 hours away, but he made it in 6.5, stopping only once for gas and coffee. He drove through the night, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. An HOA? His mother's property had never been part of any homeowners association. He'd grown up on that land. It was private property, standalone, miles from any kind of organized community. What had changed? When he finally turned onto the familiar road that led to the ranch, the sun was just starting to come up. But the first thing he saw made his blood run cold. There was a new development where there used to be open land, Meadowbrook Estates, according to the fancy entrance with its marble pillars and iron gates. The houses were huge cookie-cutter mansions packed close together, each with a manicured lawn and a 3-car garage. It looked expensive and sterile and completely out of place next to the rural landscape he remembered. Then he turned onto his mother's property, and his hands gripped the steering wheel so hard it hurt. The ranch looked beaten down. The fence, his father's fence that had stood strong and proud for 30 years, had official notices stapled all over it. Bright orange spray paint marked various sections of the property. Part of his mother's garden, the one she'd lovingly tended for decades, had been torn up. Construction flags dotted the earth like some kind of invasion markers. James parked his truck and sat there for a moment, forcing himself to breathe, to think, to not react out of pure rage. He'd been trained to keep his emotions in check, to assess situations calmly and strategically. But this was his mother. This was home, and someone had violated both. He found her in the kitchen, and it nearly broke his heart. Margaret was sitting at the table, surrounded by stacks of papers, legal documents, violation notices, bills printed on official letterhead. She looked smaller than he remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with stress and fear. When she heard him come in, she looked up, and the relief that flooded her face made him want to tear apart whoever had done this to her. "Jamie," she said, and then she was up and in his arms, holding on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had gone crazy. "I'm here, Mom," he said quietly. "I'm here, and it's going to be okay. Tell me everything." They sat at that kitchen table for 3 hours while Margaret walked him through the whole nightmare. The HOA's sudden claim that her property fell under their jurisdiction. The violations that made no sense. The mounting fines that now totaled over $47,000. The lien on her property. The threats of forced sale. And the man behind it all, Derek Vance, who'd treated her with contempt and made it clear he didn't care about her situation or her rights. As his mother talked, James noticed details that made his training kick in. She wasn't eating properly. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her hands shook slightly when she sorted through papers. This wasn't just stressful for her. It was destroying her, breaking down a woman who'd survived so much already. When she finished, James sat back and looked at the mountain of documents on the table. His mother was watching him nervously, like she was afraid he'd tell her it was hopeless, that there was nothing to be done. Instead, he reached across the table and took her hand. "Mom, do you trust me?" "Of course I do." "Then I need you to stop worrying. As of right now, this is my mission. I'm going to handle it." He saw her start to protest, to say she didn't want to be a burden, and he squeezed her hand. "You're not a burden. You're my mother. And someone made a very big mistake when they decided to mess with you. They have no idea what's coming." That night, after making sure his mother ate a proper meal and got some rest, James started working. He didn't sleep. Sleep was a luxury he'd learned to do without when necessary, and this was necessary. He sat at that kitchen table with his laptop and every document the HOA had sent, and he started reading. The first thing he did was call his buddy Tony Rodriguez, who'd served with him for 5 years before retiring and going to law school. Tony now specialized in military family legal issues and had a particular hatred for people who preyed on vulnerable populations. When James explained the situation, Tony's response was immediate and angry. "They're doing what to your mom? Are you kidding me? Send me everything. Every single document. I'm on this. The second call was to Carlos Martinez, another veteran who'd left the service and started a private investigation firm. Carlos had a particular skill set when it came to digging up information that people wanted to keep hidden. If there was something dirty about this HOA situation, Carlos would find it. A HOA going after a 93-year-old widow? Carlos said when James explained. Yeah, that smells wrong from every angle. Give me 48 hours. I'll find out what's really going on here. As the sun came up on his first full day back, James walked the property line with a handheld GPS unit, marking coordinates and taking photos. He photographed every violation notice, every piece of orange spray paint, every construction flag. He documented everything methodically, building his case the way he'd been trained to gather intelligence in the field. Around noon, a truck pulled up to the property. Two men got out, one with a clipboard, one with a camera. They didn't knock on the door or ask permission. They just started walking around the property, taking pictures of the fence and the stable. James walked out to meet them. They didn't see him coming until he was right there, and both men jumped. He didn't blame them. He was 6'2", carrying 215 pounds of muscle, and he hadn't shaved in a couple days. He knew what he looked like, especially when he was angry. And he was very, very angry. Can I help you? He asked, his voice quiet and controlled. The man with the clipboard recovered first. We're from the Meadowbrook HOA. We're documenting code violations on this property. This is private property. You're trespassing. The man's face got red. We have authorization from the HOA board to inspect properties under our jurisdiction. Show me your authorization. The man fumbled with his clipboard, pulling out a document. James took it and read it carefully. It was full of legal language and official stamps, but something about it felt off. The boundaries described didn't match the actual survey of his mother's property. This authorization is based on a boundary reassessment, James said. I'd like to see the official county filing for that reassessment. The two men looked at each other. We don't have that with us. Then you need to leave. Right now. If you come back on this property without proper legal authorization and permission from the property owner, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Do we understand each other? The men left quickly, and James watched them go with cold satisfaction. But he knew this was just the beginning. These guys were foot soldiers. The real enemy was whoever was giving the orders. That evening, Tony called back with news. I've been going through the documents you sent. James, this whole thing stinks. I can't find any record of a legitimate boundary reassessment filed with the county. I've got a buddy in the county clerk's office who's looking into it, but preliminary search shows nothing. If there's no official reassessment, then the HOA has no jurisdiction over your mom. James spent the next week working like he was planning a military operation, because in a way he was. This wasn't combat in the traditional sense, but it was still a battle, and he approached it with the same level of precision and strategy that had kept him alive through dozens of dangerous missions overseas. Every morning, he'd wake up before dawn and go through the documents again. Tony had sent him copies of the county records, and just as suspected, there was no official boundary reassessment on file. The document the HOA had been using was fake. Someone had created it, made it look official with stamps and signatures, and used it to justify their harassment of his mother, and who knows how many other people. Carlos kept digging too, and what he found painted an even uglier picture. He'd tracked down the other property owners who'd been targeted. An 80-year-old man named Robert Chen who'd lost his home of 30 years after the HOA fined him into bankruptcy. A young couple, the Hendersons, who'd paid over $60,000 in bogus fines before finally giving up and selling their house at a loss. A disabled veteran named Bill Cooper, who was currently fighting foreclosure over violations that included the color of his front door and the type of mailbox he had. James interviewed every single one of them, taking detailed notes, recording their stories with permission. Each conversation made him angrier, but he kept that anger cold and controlled. Hot rage made you sloppy. Cold rage made you dangerous. The more he learned, the clearer the pattern became. Derek Vance would identify properties on the edge of the HOA's jurisdiction, usually owned by people who seemed vulnerable in some way. Elderly folks, people going through hard times, anyone who might not have the resources to fight back. Then he'd use the fake boundary reassessment to claim HOA authority over their property. Violations would pile up, fines would accumulate, and eventually people would either pay up or lose their homes. Either way, Vance and his associates made money. It was a scam, plain and simple, but it was a sophisticated one. hidden behind legal language and official-looking documents. Most people didn't have the knowledge or resources to see through it. They just assumed the HOA had the authority it claimed to have. But James wasn't most people, and he had resources that Derek Vance never counted on. On Thursday evening, James told his mother he was going out for a bit. The monthly HOA meeting was that night, and he planned to attend. Margaret tried to talk him out of it, worried he'd lose his temper, but James kissed her forehead and promised he'd be on his best behavior. "I'm just going to observe," he said. "Maybe ask a few questions." The meeting was held in the community center at Meadowbrook Estates, a fancy building with marble floors and expensive furniture. James arrived 20 minutes early and took a seat in the back row. The room slowly filled up with residents, about 30 people total, most of them looking tired or annoyed. These were people who'd been strong-armed into attending, threatened with fines if they missed too many meetings. Derek Vance walked in right at 7 o'clock, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He had 2 other board members with him, both looking uncomfortable. James watched carefully, reading body language, noting who seemed confident and who seemed nervous. The meeting started with standard business. Minutes from the last meeting, financial reports, updates on community maintenance. Then they got to the part James was waiting for. New business, property violations and enforcement actions. "We have several properties currently in violation of community standards," Vance said, his voice smooth and professional. "Most have been cooperative and are working to remedy the issues. However, we have one particularly difficult situation that requires board action." He pulled up a photo on the projector screen, and James felt his hands clench. It was his mother's ranch, taken from an angle that made the property look run down and neglected. "This property," Vance continued, "has been in violation of multiple code standards for months. The owner has been non-responsive to our outreach efforts and has refused to comply with reasonable requests. The outstanding fines now total over $47,000. The board previously placed a lien on the property, and tonight we need to vote on whether to accelerate foreclosure proceedings." Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. One woman raised her hand. "Excuse me, but isn't that the Sullivan Ranch? That property has been there for decades. How is it even under HOA jurisdiction?" Vance's smile didn't waver. "The recent boundary reassessment placed the property within our jurisdiction. Mrs. Sullivan was notified of this change and of the violations that needed to be addressed. Unfortunately, she's chosen to ignore those notifications." James stood up. Every head in the room turned to look at him, and he felt the familiar calm settle over him. This was it. Time to engage the enemy. "I'd like to say something," he said quietly. Vance's smile flickered. "And you are?" "James Sullivan, Margaret's son." He walked slowly down the aisle toward the front of the room. He wasn't threatening, wasn't aggressive, but his military bearing was impossible to miss. The way he moved, the way he held himself, everything about him said this was not someone to mess with. "Mr. Sullivan," Vance said, recovering his composure, "if you'd like to discuss your mother's violations, you can schedule an appointment with the office." "No, I think I'll discuss them right here, right now, in front of everyone." James reached the front row and turned to face Vance directly. "You mentioned a boundary reassessment that placed my mother's property under HOA jurisdiction. Can you provide the official county filing number for that assessment?" Vance's eyes narrowed. "That information is in our files. I'm sure it is. But I'm asking for the official county filing number. Every legitimate boundary reassessment has to be filed with the county clerk's office. It's public record. So what's the filing number?" The room had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching this exchange like it was a tennis match. Vance shuffled some papers. "I don't have that information with me at the moment." "Interesting. Because I spent some time at the county clerk's office this week, and I couldn't find any record of a boundary reassessment affecting my mother's property. In fact, according to the county's official records, her property has never been part of any HOA jurisdiction." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Vance's face was starting to turn red. "If there's been an administrative error in the filing process—" "It's not an administrative error," James cut him off. "The document you've been using doesn't exist in county records because it was never legally filed. Which means every violation notice you've sent my mother, every fine you've assessed, and the lien you placed on her property are all based on fraudulent documentation." Now people were really talking. The woman who'd asked the earlier question spoke up again. "Is this true?" Has the HOA been claiming jurisdiction based on fake paperwork? Vance tried to regain control. This is not the appropriate forum for these accusations. Mr. Sullivan, if you have concerns about the legal basis for our actions, you should address them through proper legal channels, not grandstand at a community meeting. James smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Oh, don't worry. I'm definitely addressing this through legal channels, son. My attorney filed a lawsuit against you and this HOA board this morning. Fraud, elder abuse, attempted theft, conspiracy. We're also filing a RICO claim because of the pattern of fraudulent activity involving multiple properties. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the board members sitting next to Vance looked shocked. You're also going to be interested to know, James continued, addressing the crowd now, that this isn't just about my mother. We've identified at least 6 other properties that received the same treatment. Fake boundary assessments, bogus violations, inflated fines. One elderly homeowner lost his house entirely. A young couple paid $60,000 in fines that had no legal basis. Anyone in this room who's been hit with sudden violations or unexpected fines might want to talk to my attorney, because there's a good chance you were scammed too. Now everyone was talking at once. People were pulling out phones, probably checking their own violation notices. The board members were whispering urgently to each other. Vance looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. James wasn't done. I also think people should know that Derek Vance here was disbarred as an attorney in Colorado for ethics violations, and that he receives consulting fees from the development company that's been buying up properties after the HOA forces people out. Properties that, coincidentally, are all right on the edge of the development, perfect for expansion. That's defamation, Vance shouted, finally losing his cool. Security, remove this man. I'd like to see them try, James said calmly. Everything I've said is documented fact and you know it. You've been running a real estate scam using this HOA as cover, targeting vulnerable people who you thought wouldn't fight back. You made 2 mistakes, though. First, you targeted my mother, and second, you assumed she was alone. He turned back to the crowd. Anyone who's been affected by this, anyone who's paid fines or been threatened with violations, get in touch with my attorney. His name is Tony Rodriguez, and his contact information is on the lawsuit that's now public record. We're putting together a class action, and we're going to make sure every person who was hurt by this scam. The lawsuit that Tony filed wasn't just a defensive move. It was a nuclear option. James had learned early in his military career that sometimes the best defense is an overwhelming offense, and that's exactly what they were doing. The complaint was 97 pages long, meticulously detailed, and absolutely devastating. It named Derek Vance personally, along with the other board members, the surveyor who'd created the fake documents, and even the development company that had been buying up the properties. Tony had worked with 3 other attorneys to build a case that covered every angle: fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy to commit theft, racketeering, and about a dozen other charges. They weren't just going after Vance. They were going after everyone who'd profited from this scheme. The first thing Tony did was file an emergency injunction. Within 48 hours, a judge had reviewed the evidence and issued an order that stopped all HOA enforcement actions against Margaret's property immediately. The lien was removed. The fines were suspended pending investigation. The HOA was barred from contacting Margaret or entering her property without explicit court permission. When the court order came through, Margaret cried for the first time since James had been home. Not sad tears, but relief so profound it had to come out somehow. She held that piece of paper like it was made of gold, reading it over and over to make sure it was real. "It's over?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Not quite," James said gently. "But you're safe now. They can't touch the ranch. The rest is just making sure they pay for what they did." But making them pay turned out to be more complicated than just winning in court. The legal system moved slowly, and Derek Vance was getting desperate. James could see it in the way the man was acting. Carlos's surveillance team reported that Vance was making frantic phone calls, having late-night meetings with the development company representatives, and generally behaving like someone who knew the walls were closing in. Then the media really picked up the story. That video from the HOA meeting had gone viral. News stations were calling it a David versus Goliath story. The Navy SEAL standing up for his elderly mother against corporate greed and corruption. James hated the attention on himself, but he understood it was helping. Every news story, every social media post, every article meant more pressure on Vance and the HOA. It meant more victims coming forward. It meant justice was harder to avoid. The local TV station did a special report that interviewed some of the other victims. Robert Chen, the 80-year-old who'd lost his home, talked about how he'd spent his life savings fighting the HOA before finally giving up. The young couple, the Hendersons, showed documents proving they'd paid $60,000 in fines for violations that included things like having the wrong shade of white paint on their fence and planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Bill Cooper, the disabled veteran, talked about how the HOA had threatened to foreclose on his home because his wheelchair ramp didn't meet their aesthetic standards. Each story was more infuriating than the last. These were good people, just trying to live their lives, who'd been systematically abused by an organization that was supposed to serve the community. Instead, the HOA had become a weapon for theft and harassment. Tony amended the lawsuit to include all 23 families who'd been affected. It became a class action, and the potential damages went from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. The HOA's insurance company started making noise about settling, but Tony wasn't interested. Not yet. They wanted full accountability, not just a payout. Meanwhile, criminal investigations were opening up. The district attorney's office had taken an interest in the case, especially after the surveyor provided his evidence about the fake documentation. They were building a criminal case against Vance that could result in serious prison time. But James wasn't satisfied with just legal victories. He wanted to make sure this could never happen again. He started reaching out to the homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates, the regular people who had no idea their HOA board was being run by criminals. He organized a meeting, held at a local church hall since they couldn't use the HOA community center, and over 100 people showed up. Most of you had no idea what was happening, James told them. You paid your HOA fees, you followed the rules, and you assumed everything was being handled properly. But your board has been using your organization, your money, and your trust to run a criminal enterprise. The fines they've been collecting from fraudulent violations? That money was supposed to go toward community improvements. Instead, it was lining their pockets. He showed them the evidence: documents, recordings, testimony from the surveyor. By the end of the presentation, people were angry. Some were crying. Many were talking about their own experiences with the HOA, violations they'd paid for without questioning, neighbors who'd mysteriously moved away after conflicts with the board. So what do we do? Someone asked. You take back control, James said. The current board needs to be removed. You need to call an emergency election, put honest people in charge, and implement oversight measures to make sure this never happens again. I can't do that for you. This is your community. But I can tell you that change starts with people deciding they're not going to accept corruption anymore. The homeowners organized. They circulated petitions. They demanded a special meeting under the HOA bylaws. Within 2 weeks, they'd forced out the entire board. Derek Vance and his associates resigned rather than face a formal vote that would have been humiliating. A temporary committee took over, with court oversight, until proper elections could be held. But Vance wasn't done. Desperate men do desperate things, and Derek Vance was about as desperate as they come. He'd lost his position. His criminal exposure was mounting. The civil lawsuit was going to bankrupt him. And the one thing standing between him and any chance of making a deal was the evidence, the testimony from witnesses, the continued pressure from James and the victims. On a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, James was at the ranch with his mother when Carlos called. We've got a problem. Vance just left his house with 2 other guys. Big guys, look like hired muscle. And they're heading in your direction. James felt ice water flood his veins. How far out? 15 minutes, maybe 20. Call the sheriff. Tell them we've got potential trespassers heading to the property with possible intent to commit violence. I'm going to prepare. He hung up and turned to his mother. Mom, I need you to go into your bedroom and lock the door. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Margaret looked scared but determined. Jamie, what's happening? Derek Vance is making a mistake. A big one. But I need you somewhere safe while I handle it. You can't fight 3 men by yourself. James smiled, though there was no humor in it. Mom, I've fought a lot worse than 3 desperate idiots. Please, trust me and go lock yourself in your room. After she was safely locked in the bedroom, James moved through the house, turning on exterior lights, making sure the security cameras were recording, checking the locks on all the doors. He didn't bother with weapons. He didn't need them. Years of hand-to-hand combat training had made him very effective with nothing but his body. Then he waited on the front porch, sitting in one of the rocking chairs like he didn't have a care in the world. When the headlights appeared coming up the drive, he was ready. The vehicle stopped in front of the house and 3 men got out. Derek Vance and 2 guys who were obviously not lawyers or real estate developers. They were big, muscled, with the kind of aggressive posture that said they were used to intimidating people with their physical presence. "Mr. Sullivan," Vance called out. "We need to talk." "Then talk," James said, not moving from his chair. "But do it from right where you are. This is private property and you're not welcome here." Vance took a step forward. "You've caused me a lot of problems. Cost me a lot of money. Ruined my reputation. You did that to yourself when you decided to run a criminal enterprise. I'm willing to make a deal. You drop the lawsuit, convince the others to drop their complaints, and I'll make sure your mother gets compensated. We can all walk away from this." James stood up slowly and all 3 men tensed. "Here's the thing, Vance. You seem to think you're in a position to negotiate. You're not. You committed crimes. Multiple crimes. Against my mother and against a lot of other people. There's no deal that makes that okay." Vance's face twisted with anger. "You self-righteous piece of—" He nodded to the 2 men with him. "Teach him some manners." The 2 hired muscles started forward and James sighed. This was exactly what he'd been expecting. What Vance didn't understand was that James wasn't some suburban homeowner who'd be intimidated by a couple of thugs. He was a Navy SEAL who'd survived combat situations that would have killed most people. The first guy reached the porch steps and swung at James. It was a big, telegraphed punch, the kind someone throws when they're used to their size doing most of the work. James sidestepped it easily, grabbed the man's extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the porch railing. The wood splintered with the impact and the guy went down hard. The second guy was smarter. He came in more carefully, trying to grapple. But James had been trained in close-quarters combat by some of the best fighters in the world. He broke the grapple to live. 3 months after Derek Vance began serving his sentence, life at the Sullivan Ranch had returned to something better than normal. It was better because Margaret no longer carried the weight of fear and worry that had been crushing her for so long. She walked taller, smiled easier, and had even started hosting the weekly card game with her friends that she'd canceled months ago when the HOA troubles started. The settlement money sat in a trust account that James had helped his mother set up. $850,000 that represented not just compensation for what she'd been through, but security for the rest of her life. They'd used some of it right away for necessary repairs. The fence got a fresh coat of paint, the stable roof was fixed, and they'd hired a local contractor to do some maintenance work that Margaret had been putting off for years. But James knew the money was only part of the healing. What his mother really needed was to feel safe again, to know that her home was truly hers and that no one could ever threaten it again. So he'd gone a step further. He'd hired a part-time ranch hand, a young veteran named Tyler who'd recently left the service and was looking for work. Tyler came by 3 times a week to help with the heavy lifting, the repairs, the things that were getting harder for Margaret to do on her own. James had also set up a security system, though he'd been careful to make it discreet. Cameras at the entrance and around the property, good locks on all the doors, motion sensor lights. Nothing that would make the ranch feel like a fortress, but enough to give his mother peace of mind. The best part, though, was watching the community heal. The new HOA board was like night and day compared to the old one. They'd elected a retired school teacher named Patricia Jennings as president, and her first order of business was apologizing. Not just to Margaret, but to everyone who'd been harmed. She'd gone door to door, talking to people, listening to their concerns, promising that things would be different. And they were different. The new board implemented transparency measures. All meetings were recorded and posted online. Financial reports were detailed and available to any homeowner who wanted to see them. There was a complaint process with actual oversight. Most importantly, they'd amended their bylaws to prevent the kind of overreach that Vance had used to hurt so many people. The families who'd been victimized were healing too. Robert Chen had bought a nice condo near his daughter's family. James had visited him once, and the old man had tears in his eyes as he thanked James for fighting when he no longer had the strength to fight himself. The Hendersons used their settlement to pay off their debts and start over somewhere new, somewhere without the bad memories. Bill Cooper stayed in his home, finally able to make it fully accessible without fear of HOA violations. But James knew he couldn't stay forever. He was still active duty, and eventually he'd be called back to service. The thought of leaving his mother used to terrify him, especially now that he knew how vulnerable she'd been. But he'd put systems in place to protect her. More than that, he'd built a network. It started with Tyler, the ranch hand, but it expanded from there. James had reached out to other veterans in the area, guys who'd served and understood the importance of looking out for each other and their families. They'd formed an informal network, a group that checked on elderly folks in the community, helped with repairs, and kept an eye out for any signs of the kind of exploitation Margaret had faced. They called it the Veterans Community Watch, and it grew faster than James had expected. Within 2 months, they had 40 volunteers covering a 3-county area. They'd already helped prevent 2 other potential HOA scams, stepping in early when they saw the warning signs of harassment and intimidation. The local news did a feature on the program, and James found himself doing interviews again, though he always deflected credit to the other volunteers. "We serve to protect people," he'd said in one interview. "That doesn't stop just because we're not in uniform anymore. If we can use our training and experience to help vulnerable people in our own communities, why wouldn't we?" The story resonated. Other veteran groups in other states started reaching out, asking how to set up similar programs. James worked with Tony to create a simple guide, a framework that other communities could use. It felt good, taking something terrible that had happened to his mother and turning it into something that could help protect others. On a Saturday morning in late spring, James woke up to the smell of his mother's cooking. Bacon, eggs, fresh biscuits. He walked into the kitchen to find her humming as she worked, and it hit him how far they'd come. Just a few months ago, she'd been a scared woman surrounded by threatening letters, wondering if she'd lose everything. Now she was herself again, happy and strong and safe. "Big day today," she said when she saw him. "You sure you want to do this?" "Absolutely," James said. "It's important." This was a community barbecue they were hosting at the ranch. It had been Margaret's idea, actually. She wanted to bring people together, to show that the ranch wasn't just a symbol of what they'd fought against, but a symbol of community and resilience. They'd invited everyone who'd been affected by the HOA scam, the new board members, the neighbors, the veterans from the Community Watch program, and anyone else who wanted to come. By noon, the ranch was full of people. Kids were running around the property, playing with Margaret's horses under supervision. Adults were gathered in groups talking and laughing. The smell of barbecue filled the air as Tyler and some of the other veterans handled the grills. Tables were loaded with food that people had brought to share. James found himself moving through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting thanks he still didn't feel he deserved. He'd just been protecting his mother. Anyone would have done the same, he thought, though Tony had pointed out that not anyone could have done what James did. Not everyone had the resources, the training, or the connections. That was exactly why the Veterans Community Watch was so important. Robert Chen showed up with his daughter and grandchildren. He found Margaret and hugged her for a long time. 2 elderly people who'd survived something traumatic and come out the other side. "We're survivors," he told her. "That's what we are." The Hendersons came too, even though they'd moved an hour away. They wanted to be part of this, to celebrate the victory with the people who'd fought alongside them. Their kids played with the other children, and for a few hours, you'd never know the trauma this family had been through. Bill Cooper arrived in his wheelchair, and James noticed that several of the veterans immediately made sure he had easy access to everything, adjusting tables and chairs, making sure pathways were clear. That's what brotherhood looked like, James thought, looking out for each other without being asked. Patricia Jennings, the new HOA president, gave a short speech that James hadn't known was planned. She stood up on the porch and called for everyone's attention. "I want to thank Margaret Sullivan for hosting us today," she said, "and I want to thank James Sullivan for showing us all what it means to stand up for what's right. What happened to Margaret and so many others was a betrayal of trust. It was cruel and it was criminal. But it also showed us something important. It showed us that ordinary people, when they work together, when they refuse to accept injustice, can make extraordinary changes." She paused, looking at the crowd. "The new HOA board made a decision this week. We're establishing a fund to help homeowners who are facing financial difficulty due to medical bills, job loss, or other hardships. We're calling it the Sullivan Fund, in honor of the woman who almost lost everything and the son who made sure that didn't happen. Because that's what communities should do. We should lift each other up, not tear each other down. The crowd applauded, and James saw his mother wipe away tears. He walked over and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way she used to when he was a kid and needed comfort. Except now he was the one offering comfort, and it felt right. Like the natural order of things. As the afternoon wore on and the sun started to sink toward the horizon, James found a quiet moment to sit on the porch with his mother. The party was still going on around them, but they had a little bubble of peace. "You're going to have to go back soon," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," James admitted. "Got orders. 2 weeks. Where?" "Can't say." "You know that," she nodded. They'd had this conversation so many times over the years. "Will you worry about me while you're gone?" James thought about that. A few months ago, the answer would have been yes. He would have worried constantly, wondering if she was safe, if she was okay, if someone else might try to take advantage of her. But now, no, he said honestly. "I won't worry. You've got Tyler checking in regularly. You've got the Veterans Watch Network. You've got friends and neighbors who actually care about you. You've got a good HOA board that's looking out for the community instead of exploiting it. And most importantly, you've got that stubborn strength that got you through 47 years on this ranch. You're going to be fine." "You taught me something," Margaret said softly. "All those years I thought I had to handle everything on my own. I thought asking for help was weakness. But watching you these past months, seeing how you pulled people together, how you built this network of support, I realized that community isn't weakness, it's strength."